September has been quite the month for Souls-like games, especially of the pixel art variety. No Place for Bravery continues that trend, but with a bit more of a palatable experience than many of the alternatives I've been testing out. And while I doubt it will land as my game of the year, it will make it near the top of the list so far, since it brings a lot of great quality of life improvements, not to mention some pretty decent gameplay to the table. Starting out though, let's knock out its weakest point, but one that I hope future designers of games will pay attention to, and that is the story. It's functional, but doesn't really drag you too far in, since they went a bit heavy-handed with the painting of the main character's personality and flaws, which frankly gets a little bit grating. But overall story is fine, and it does one interesting thing that I wish more games did. It lets you choose the end of your journey. This isn't so much necessarily multiple endings in the traditional sense, but rather you get to choose when your character has been pushed too far on their way to their goal and just wants to take a peaceful ending, with major decision points allowing you the ability to see what happens if you give up your journey and decide to focus on peace at that given juncture. Sure, you fail at your overall journey, but it gives you an idea of what some of the more peaceful paths you can take are. Though as you go further through the game, you will realize these outcomes don't fit the personality of your character, but it's an interesting story tool nonetheless, since it lets you avoid the infamous "but thou must" trope of games across multiple genres. So basically, I like how they did the story, even if the story itself really didn't do as much for me as other titles I've been playing. I appreciate that they took the effort to implement something a bit different and more intriguing to engage with. As far as the rest of the game, outside some minor visual bugs and a little weird feeling to the mobile blocks during the platforming sections, I loved my experience with No Place for Bravery, especially once I got used to the weapons you pick up through the journey, which it gives you a small taste of during the what can only be called a tutorial, even though it didn't really pull punches for it. But what you end up fleshing out a lot by playing the game and unlocking the various weapon skills is even more enjoyable. That said, even if you find yourself struggling with the more even pacing of the game and these weapons, rather than the hectic action and slow methodical nature of many other Souls-likes of different flavors, it will help you out with that, since unlike these other Souls-likes, you can customize the experience to your personal taste. Since even though there is a difficulty slider, you can manually adjust your health, damage, stamina, and even the parry window through the menu, so it becomes much more accessible to a wide variety of players and play styles. And if it gets too easy or too hard, you can quickly adjust it to keep it at that just right feeling. Now, why I call the combat even-paced is that it actually reaches a nice balance between its offensive and defensive feel, and I really like the tuning they have, especially on your starter sword and shield, which really fall into a nice tempo of attacks and dodges and parries against various enemies you encounter. And while there are a few cheese strategies you can pull off against various enemies in the game, it just feels good to do battle how it's intended here. Though, if you're struggling with certain encounters, there are plenty of options for dealing with it using the alternative methods. As far as that enemy design, it's somewhat varied, the sprites more so than the enemies, since for the most part you have the same kind of flavors of enemies from group to group, it's just each has a little bit more flavor added than its predecessor, with the most basic just being daggers, bows, and a bruiser, but as it upgrades you start getting stealth versions of these, or ones using throwing potions or daggers instead of bows, and it just goes up from there. And to keep you from falling on a sword or bow rut, there are enemies that are more prone to certain attacks than others to keep it interesting. Usually the biggest deviations from the normal formula are of course going to be the bosses, as well as the upgrade guards, which are optional but nice to have since they're more side grades rather than strictly more powerful options outside of a few examples. For example, you can unlock a whirlwind attack for the hammer that makes things easier, but it's not necessarily to beat the game by any means. In general, probably the most useful trait you will learn to take advantage of will be staggering against all these enemies, whether this is through well-timed blows with the weapons or through the use of the parry system, which yes, even works on some ranged enemies. And it's really solid, I might add. And none of that requires the use of special abilities or unlocks, they just make them easier to reach. I would say probably the two enemy types though that most people will get frustrated with will be the invisible enemies, but if you watch the ground you can strike their footsteps, and the other one, which is the potion enemies that will cover your screen in ink and do acid damage over time. But hey, they're easy enough to snipe and will only move if you get close to them, so use those ranged weapons. So for as rough as these might feel at first to beat, once you get the strategy down, they feel significantly better to fight and more balanced, and they've been balanced nicely to not feel cheap once you do get used to them. That said, if you're just not able to get their patterns down, the game is fairly generous with access it gives you to items through shopping, so you can just farm up ranged items to take them out from a distance, or even farm up healing items that you face tank through your problems. Though do be careful not to get overwhelmed, since healing will only do so much, and ranged weapons will only go so far, at least until you get the bow. Goodness knows I bought myself way too many of the throwing knives for when I was feeling lazy, but they really weren't needed for completion, and the game was fairly fair. As far as world navigation and such, there's a decent amount of backtracking potential for upgrades, and you will eventually get a fast travel option to make this easier, but you could actually go through the game beat for beat with minimal backtracking if you wanted. Though sadly, there's very little in the way of potential sequence breaks that I saw, but we'll have to see what speedrunners do with the game to possibly fix or bypass that. The world map itself is also fairly nicely done, maybe a bit too much information given for some people's taste, but once you grab the maps off the ground, it'll show you the locations of key upgrade items, your objective, etc., but it will hide hidden bonus items like the money chest and the lore, so you'll have an excuse to explore if you're a completionist for that type of stuff, but you won't have to spend forever looking through every nook and cranny to make sure you can get that whirlwind. And thankfully, even with the more kind of just completionist stuff, it's generally pretty easy to find due to the blocky style of most of the content and highly stylized atmosphere. You'll generally be able to spot most of it pretty easily, with only a couple chests of money really not standing out in the environment to me. Most of the rest of the stuff was pretty obvious that it was more than just environmental kind of art. The music and sound design generally fall into the same category of being enjoyable, fitting the mood, and even being something I would enjoy listening to maybe on its own or while I'm painting. And while I wouldn't say the tracks in particular will stick in your mind for years to come, they are great at doing what they do, which is setting an atmosphere of the experience without overwhelming it, a trait that a lot of reviewers I know often overlook when they're looking for that banger track to recommend, rather than just effective sound design, which this game does quite well. So overall, No Place for Bravery is feeling really well designed for me, and despite the game being a bit shorter than similarly priced titles, it's well worth it if you enjoy this subgenre of Souls-likes, and frankly, I enjoyed it enough that I might end up doing another playthrough on stream after release, but we will see. And if you're looking for another game that's similar to this, but a little bit more hardcore for those of you that like the tougher challenges, check out the game on screen now. And as usual, if this sounds like a title you would enjoy and you want to support the channel as well as give a little bit to charity, you can find an affiliate link to it on Humble Bundle below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.